Again, General Clapper, where's the secular, nonviolent part of this again? Helpfully attached to this explanatory memorandum, this strategic plan, was this list of 29 organizations. Again, this is 1991. I'm going to show you two of the most prominent: the Islamic Society of North America, better known as ISNA, the number one group, and this one, the Council on American Islamic Relations. Well, it's actually listed here as the Islamic Association for Palestine, not CARE. The difference is that in 1991, CARE didn't exist, but the Islamic Association for Palestine did. We know that it was the precursor to the Council on American Islamic Relations, because back in the day when the FBI was doing this sort of thing, they wiretapped the foundational meeting of the Council on American Islamic Relations in 1993 in Philadelphia. And they heard these guys, principals of the Islamic Association of Palestine, saying, we need to set up a political warfare and fundraising arm for Hamas. So we're pretty clear about the pedigree of these guys. Now I'm going to turn and take the rest of the time with you to talk about how the Muslim Brotherhood is waging a kind of stealthy or civilization jihad against us using 6 different techniques. There are more, but this is give you a flavor of it. Starting with keeping us ignorant of the very fact that this is even going on, which, as Sun Tzu pointed out, about 5,000 years ago, is kind of counterproductive. If you're trying to protect yourself against an enemy, you don't know who they are, really hard to do. This is so self-evident, you'll forgive me if it sounds as though I'm insulting your intelligence, but I'm going to give you an example of how this is working out in practice. Back in 1994, as you may remember, a commission impaneled to look into how it was that 19 Sharia adherent jihadists managed to hijack 4 planes and fly 3 of them into buildings, killing roughly 3,000 of our countrymen. Not surprisingly, the Blue Ribbon Commission that did that study used words like jihad, Muslim, Islam, Muslim Brotherhood, and so on, Al-Qaeda, scores if not hundreds of times. Again, this is a very crude method of just making a point. But some of the Muslim Brotherhood groups, including those that were on the list I just showed you from the 1991 memorandum, went to the federal government after this came out and said, we take offense at the use of these terms. Surely the government can come up with other words to describe the problem. So how did that work out? Well, in 2008, the FBI Counterterrorism Lexicon, the FBI being, of course, the agency responsible for defending us against these kinds of characters. Oh, all those words weren't used. Weren't used by the agency responsible for protecting us against a threat from Sharia adherent jihadists. How about this? 2009, the National Intelligence Strategy. Well, they're not used there either. Well, surely, in connection with, and these are just illustrative, the attack by a Sharia adherent jihadist in which 13, 14 if you count a child in utero, were killed at Fort Hood by a guy who believed that he was doing this in keeping with his religious obligations under Sharia. Surely the after-action report of that attack would use some of these words. well, actually, the most striking thing about this is even the approved euphemism of violent extremism didn't make the cut in the after-action report on the Fort Hood massacre. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what I think this bespeaks, and it's, again, just illustrative, is a willful blindness at the hands of our enemies. They've told us what we can say and what we can't say, and that means they've got an influence over what we can do and what we can't do. Because after all, if you don't know the enemy, it does bear on how you'll do against them. A second technique that's being employed by the Muslim Brotherhood particularly is getting their people into positions in which they can exercise the kind of influence that I've just suggested is at play. Particularly by putting them into government. Now, in fact, I could have introduced you to another document here that came out of the treasure trove of the El Barasa basement, which was a phased plan. 5 phases that go from the start of the Muslim Brotherhood's infrastructure being built in this country, the 29 groups that I mentioned there being exemplary, but it's now up to thousands. Stealthy, covert establishment of a leadership group, then over the next 3 phases, beginning to be more assertively out there, challenging the leadership through political means, through the media, and ultimately in phase 5, through violence, overthrowing the government. But getting into these sorts of positions is a critically important part of the stealth jihad. I'll show you this slide because this chap is a fellow by the name of Sheikh Kifa Mustafa. Like Ismail el-Barasa, he's been implicated in Hamas fundraising out of Chicago. And yet you can't probably make this out, but this handsome group photo was taken in front of the seal of the National Counterterrorism Center, one of the most sensitive facilities in the United States government. What, one might ask, was Mr. Kifa Mustafa doing at the National Counterterrorism Center, aside from praying, which they all did while there? Kifa Mustafa was part of what was known as a Citizens Academy, run by the FBI, which brought him and his friends into not only this facility, but the FBI headquarters and the FBI training facility in Quantico, Virginia. In the course of which this chap, who happens to be the anchor of I think it's the NBC affiliate in Chicago, remarked, Kifa Mustafa was extremely curious about how the FBI does its job, how the counterterrorism business is done by the lead agency in counterterrorism. Does that strike you as curious? That a Hamas operative is inside the wire collecting intelligence on how we do the counterterrorism business? Well, I would suggest it should be curious, but it's also part of the penetration that I'm talking about. How about this? This is a shot of Muslim staffers in Congress praying, as they do weekly, in, I believe this is the National Capitol Visitor Center. Nothing wrong with that necessarily, except that these characters bring in guest imams each week. And the list of the people that are ministering to Muslim congressional staffers would, well, I think alarm most people. Just to give you one example, this individual. Anybody recognize him? Well, before he was on the kill or capture list and then killed, happily, Anwar al-Awlaki was an imam with one of the most notorious Wahhabi mosques outside of Washington. And while there, he was brought in to lead the Congressional Muslim Staffers Association in prayer. He was also, by the way, brought to a Pentagon breakfast to not minister, but to be part of the outreach to these characters. My point is not that there's anything wrong with Muslims praying in the Capitol or outreach to Muslims. To the contrary. Reaching out to the right Muslims is something I would very strongly recommend we be doing. What worries me sick is that we're reaching out to Anwar al-Awlaki and people like him. Even today. Obviously not him at the moment, but others like him. One of the reasons we're doing this, and I don't know if this name means anything to most of you, but there are a few of you who would recognize Grover Norquist as a prominent figure in the conservative community. He's best known for his anti-tax advocacy, something that most of us would find admirable, but I happened to tumble upon the fact that back in 1999, he started working with top Muslim Brotherhood operatives to create something called the Islamic Free Market Institute with their seed money and their staff. I happen to know that because I was sharing space with him at the time. Imagine my surprise. Two of the folks that he's been hanging with, Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, over here on the left, shown with then Governor George W. Bush in 1999, I believe it was, and Samuel Al-Arian, shown with then Governor George W. Bush on the campaign trail at Disney World. Both are now convicted terrorists. He's still in prison serving what was originally a 23-year prison sentence for trying to kill the crown prince, now king of Saudi Arabia, with money from Muammar Gaddafi. And Samuel Al-Arian was convicted of running Palestinian Islamic Jihad from his office in the University of South Florida. Both of these cats were, thanks to Grover and his team, given access to and influence over the Obama administration now, but before that, the Bush administration. And I have to tell you, this worries me terribly because it's worse now than it was back in the Bush years. These guys went to jail, but the people that they have helped put into place in government are not. So that just gives you a very, very superficial treatment of the problem of influence operators inside, as I say, the wire.